In July of 1945, Allied leaders convened at the Potsdam Conference. Hitler was dead, and the war in Europe was over. Japan was near defeat, but a massive final battle loomed. During the pivotal time surrounding Potsdam, events external to the conference influenced growing U.S.-Soviet tensions as much as, or more than, its proceedings. The death of President Roosevelt, the departure of Prime Minister Churchill, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, and the successful test of an atomic weapon combined to define the start of a new era in U.S.-Soviet relations as World War II came to an end. The months that followed the February 1945 Yalta Conference profoundly changed circumstances for the Allies. In April, the death of President Roosevelt brought a new member to the Big Three in Harry S. Truman. This newcomer to international politics would have to navigate the complexities of coalition warfare and diplomacy, alongside veteran statesmen Stalin and Churchill, with the Red Army entrenched in Eastern Europe. When American and Soviet forces met along Germany's Elbe River on April 25th, power over Europe's fate shifted to two new superpowers. It was a moment for celebration, but was this new president ready to handle the responsibilities of surging American power? During his time as vice president, Truman was in no way prepared to assume his new responsibilities. Absent from Roosevelt's inner circle, he was not even briefed on the events at the Yalta Conference. But he possessed a sharp mind and was a voracious reader who quickly earned the respect of General Marshall and Admiral Leahy, and developed ties with James Burns, who became his Secretary of State. Roosevelt's informal advisors were set aside as Truman built his new team and established himself as a no-nonsense leader whose direct style stood in contrast to that of his predecessor. The new president would soon enter the international arena. In late April, Truman invited Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov to visit Washington on his way to San Francisco for the United Nations Conference on International Organization. During their meeting, Truman employed a hardline approach, warning Molotov that Russia's failure to uphold the Yalta agreements would jeopardize their relationship. To the Americans, Truman's coarseness was impressive. To Molotov, it signaled the end of U.S.-Soviet cooperation and hostility towards an ally. Was Truman's provocative approach effective, or did it feed Stalin's suspicious nature? Stalin did not appreciate Western idealism. He saw Western hypocrisy in the imperialist and capitalist system. Roosevelt and Churchill's 1941 Atlantic Charter, promising self-determination, did not apply to the British Empire or to America's influence over Latin America. In the Soviet view, the internment of Japanese Americans and British policies in India provided no moral authority from which to judge Russia. The dictator did not genuinely care about these injustices, but he did object to hypocrisy. The Soviets viewed Western imperialism as the cause of both world wars and a threat to peace, concluding that the West upheld its ideals only when it suited their interests. Were the Western allies qualified to judge Stalin, or was he adept at pointing out their wrongs to justify his own behavior? Stalin reacted to the Molotov-Truman meeting by rejecting Western interference in his post-war plans to control Poland, despite his Yalta pledge to support its freedom and independence. In San Francisco, Molotov insisted that the Soviet-backed Lublin government, and not the Western-backed London Poles, should represent Poland at the United Nations Conference. In Soviet-occupied Austria, Bulgaria, and Romania, new restrictions on freedom of movement were then imposed on American officials stationed there. Whether Stalin's position regarding Eastern Europe flowed from Truman's candor or his own ambitions is something for you to consider as this course unfolds. Truman also had to contend with Winston Churchill's concerns over excessive Soviet influence in Europe. At Yalta, the Allies agreed to occupation zones, but Churchill wanted to drive further east to create leverage for future negotiations with Stalin. Roosevelt and his generals did not want to violate the Yalta agreements, so Churchill now tried to persuade Truman. Churchill was slow to recognize the extent of the Soviet role in defeating Hitler, even though they had killed 4 of every 5 Germans, and their military losses were more than 12 times and civilian deaths 200 times those of Britain and America combined. American General George Patton also favored this approach, even making headlines in May that the United States should prepare for war with Russia after the German defeat. Mutual suspicion surfaced before Potsdam, and it did not belong solely to Stalin. American diplomats worked to calm Soviet concerns over Patton's rhetoric, but other incidents before Potsdam fueled their suspicions. Soviet intelligence learned of secret meetings in Bern, Switzerland, where Americans and German SS officers discussed a possible surrender. Soviet officials were angered by what they viewed as a betrayal of promises to seek unconditional surrender. That these meetings took place under Roosevelt, a man Stalin had trusted, raised new concerns over trusting a man he did not know. When Germany surrendered, Truman canceled Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets, who were no longer at war. It was thought that this would pressure Russia to enter the war against Japan quickly, whereupon shipments would resume. Stalin called the halt scornful and abrupt, warning that it threatened future cooperation. Though he intended to join the war against Japan, he would not tolerate being coerced by a sudden withdrawal of aid. Was Stalin justified in his reaction, or did Truman wisely leverage Soviet aid? At Potsdam, Allied leaders, acutely aware of history, wished above all to avoid repeating the failure of the 1919 Versailles Treaty to prevent another catastrophic war. Despite recent frictions, the Americans remained optimistic, but the Soviets were already displeased with their new team. On balance, the conference accomplished very little, but it was regarded favorably by attendees and in the media as a dramatic improvement over Versailles. The two main objectives of the destruction of German power and Soviet commitment to enter the war against Japan were achieved. On the fate of Eastern Europe, most notably Poland, there was little the Western Allies could do to avoid the inevitable Soviet domination of the region. Soviet occupation was a reality, and Stalin had no intention of giving back territorial gains. Truman secured Stalin's commitment to enter the war against Japan, but Stalin had already ordered preparations. On July 18th, Truman received news of the successful test of an atomic weapon. Yet Stalin, through his spies, already knew about the Manhattan Project. No mention of the weapon that would play a key role in the Cold War appeared in the minutes. The sudden departure of Churchill, after his surprising election loss, did not change British policy at Potsdam, but it did subtract his influence from an alliance that increasingly revolved around superpowers. Stalin came to Potsdam with the clear advantage of a strong presence in Eastern Europe, rendering much of the debate surrounding it irrelevant. He had also already decided to invade Manchuria. Months earlier, the new President Truman struck a decidedly different tone towards a Soviet ally than his predecessor, and with the arrival of atomic weaponry, a new factor promised to intensify mistrust between them. Declining British power and the departure of Churchill further shifted the balance of power from the Big Three to the superpowers. Together, these developments altered the US-Soviet relationship as it deteriorated into a Cold War.